Thank you, Darren, and good evening, everyone. It's good to be with you all. So before I begin to say what I want to say to you this evening, I'd like to address a question that is no doubt on the minds of at least a few of you. And it's actually a question that I had to answer in my own mind a few months ago when the organizers of this event approached me and asked me if I would be the keynote speaker this evening. The question is, why would a Catholic priest be chosen to speak at an event like this on parental power? And more to the point, what would that Catholic priest have to say that would contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way? So when I was first approached, I thought to myself, this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. I'm going to have to think and pray about this before I agree to this assignment. But as I did think and pray, something significant occurred to me, namely that this subject, the subject of parental power, has a direct connection to one of my real passions, namely the passion for the protection of religious liberty. In other words, I believe that there is a direct nexus between the subject of religious liberty and the subject of parental power. More about that nexus later. Secondly, while clearly not everyone here this evening is Catholic, this issue we are talking about, as has already been pointed out, transcends religious belief in the same way that it transcends political parties, or should. That fact should be clear from the diversity of speakers that we have on the schedule, as well as the diversity of organizations that we have represented in the back on the tables here this evening. Because this has everything to do with us as parents proclaiming assertively by our words and by our deeds that our children are not wards of the state. And because they are not, we know better than the state does what is best for our children. And by the way, a memo to the LGBTQ community. We do not hate you, not in the least. So please do not accuse us of hate. We do not hate you. For those of us who are Christians, that is never ever an option. We just want our kids left alone. And by our kids, let me clarify that if you are not aware of it, I am, through a generous dispensation by then Pope Benedict XVI, a dispensation on behalf of former Anglican priests, which I once was, I am a Roman Catholic priest who is also a married man. My wonderful wife, Jan, and I have been married for almost 54 years. She's here with me this evening. We are Thank you. We are blessed to have 4 grown children who are also here this evening. And thank you. And those 4 children have blessed us with 19 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. So you might say that I, along with you, have a dog in this fight. So then I'd like to begin this evening with a quote from St. Peter the Apostle. Now don't worry, I'm not going to be preaching a sermon this evening, although, Darren, this looks like a congregation, doesn't it? The context of this quote is chapter 5 of the Acts of the Apostles. It takes place probably only weeks or months after Jesus' ascension to heaven and the descent of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Peter and the other apostles have been dragged into the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council in Jerusalem at the time, and they're being interrogated by the Pharisees on the council for teaching the people in the name of Christ, and are once again ordered to stop as they had been previously. Acts chapter 5, verse 29. Peter, speaking for the apostles, responds and says simply this, quote, "We must obey God rather than men. We must obey God rather than men. As you read further, you see that the Sanhedrin's reaction to Peter's bold proclamation was that they became enraged and they wanted to kill the apostles. And the ultimate result of this confrontation was that the stage was set for a protracted persecution of the church by the religious leadership in Jerusalem. That persecution was then superseded by an even bloodier, more oppressive persecution that lasted for 250 years under the Roman Empire. Why? Again, because the early Christians chose to obey God rather than men, when men were telling them first to stop teaching in the name of Jesus, and then that they had to worship the pagan gods of Rome, something that the early Christians were not willing to do. And as you read the accounts of those early martyrs of the church, you continually find them speaking truth to power in repeating to the authorities of the day some variation of Peter's words, "We must obey God rather than men." All through the 2,000-year history of the church, it has been the same whenever and wherever the church has suffered persecution, as it does to this day in various parts of the world. And yet, as 21st century Americans, when you and I contemplate religious persecution, our minds automatically kind of compartmentalize it into a phenomenon that was long ago or today is far away. And if our sensitivities are jogged by something we read about the oppression of Christians in Somalia or Yemen or Nigeria or China or North Korea or anywhere else in the world, we might respond by whispering a quick prayer for our persecuted brothers and sisters and then consoling ourselves with the thought that it couldn't happen here. Could it? After all, don't we have a constitution that guarantees us the freedom of religion in America? While that is true in principle, I would point out to you that the influence of two pervasive trends in our modern culture can, and in fact already have begun, to erode those freedoms that should be guaranteed to all people of faith in the U.S. Constitution. One of those trends is statism, and the other is secularism. Statism and secularism. Let's take a moment to define those terms. Statism is the ideological tendency to amass more and more power to the government, especially the central government, for the purpose of controlling and regulating both the lives of individuals and the affairs of institutions. It is a philosophy in which the state, especially at the federal level, becomes in effect a god. Secularism, on the other hand, is a worldview defined by the initiative to remove every vestige of religious expression or conviction from the public square and from public institutions. Thus, statism and secularism are merely two sides of the same coin. And these two forces have been on the ascendancy in our nation, a very rapid ascendancy, particularly for the past 60 years. And today have reached a point of conversion to the point where most statists are secularists and vice versa. The terms have become virtually synonymous. That convergence of statism and secularism typically manifests itself in the pervasive ideology known as, you know it, socialism. If you know anything about the history of socialism in the 20th and 21st centuries, whether in Eastern Europe or Latin America or Asia or elsewhere, its proponents have always viewed the church, I might add especially the Catholic Church, as the biggest obstacle to the advancement of its goals, and thus have viewed the church as a force to be neutralized and silenced by whatever means necessary. Now let's get real here for a moment. The current presidential administration is fully populated with avowed statists and secularists, all the way to the very top, as is their party. So, as we did then with the Obama administration, we find ourselves today with a presidential administration that has positioned itself as an adversary of the church, a position that has resulted in tension and in legal and philosophical conflict between the federal government and the church. And so we see evidence today that religious liberty is already being eroded in a serious and systematic way. And we are confronted by the once unthinkable prospect of the potential for out-and-out persecution of Christians and other people of faith in America in the future. What we are seeing in our culture is that by accelerating incremental steps through legislation, through executive orders, through regulatory practices and mandates, through court rulings, and through aggressive and very questionable actions by the Department of Justice, the government at both the federal and state levels has been putting the squeeze on the consciences of believers and infringing on the free exercise of religion, the First Amendment notwithstanding. And by the way, it's no coincidence that the very first freedom delineated by the founders in the First Amendment in the Constitution's Bill of Rights is freedom of religion. Let me remind you of exactly what it says. Quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. The convergence of statism and secularism has quickly moved our government from its perennial stance of benign neutrality toward religion, notably toward Christianity, to a stance of ever-growing and ever more aggressive hostility toward Christians, and especially, I might add, toward the Catholic Church. The examples are numerous, but I'll give you just a few to illustrate. But before I do that, let me show you how I believe, as I mentioned a moment ago, that there is this direct nexus or connection between the subjects of religious liberty and parental authority. To begin with, as you have already heard previously, parental authority is a God-given right, like virtually all of our rights, beginning with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Never, ever forget that our rights are not granted by the federal government. To the contrary, it is the government's responsibility to protect those God-given rights. What we have seen in recent years, however, is the government not only failing to protect those rights, but actively and assertively infringing upon them. So then a few examples, and all of these will be from a Catholic perspective, since that's the universe that I operate in. But those of you who come from different religious traditions can, I am sure, call to mind examples from your own faith context. I'll begin with one of the first and most significant shots across the bow of religious liberty by the federal government in recent years. You will all remember the HHS mandate, one of the most egregious provisions of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, which sought to force all employer-sponsored health care plans to provide, among other things, free, abortifacient, and contraceptive drugs to its employees, in direct contradiction of the Catholic Church's and many other Christian churches' moral teachings. But it was nonetheless applied to countless Catholic institutions, including, most notably, remember this, the Little Sisters of the Poor, who filed suit against the federal government. That mandate was, as you may know, dealt a principled blow by the Supreme Court's decision in the Hobby Lobby case. Another example. The U.S. Department of Justice has essentially declared war on Catholics and other Christians who pray peacefully in front of abortion facilities, invoking the FACE Act against them. FACE is an acronym for Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. One such Catholic is a man by the name of Mark Houck. On September the 23rd, 2022, if you're not aware of this, a team of 20 armed FBI agents in tactical gear raided Mark Houck's home in rural Pennsylvania in the early hours of the morning and arrested him at gunpoint in front of his terrified wife and 7 children, putting him in handcuffs and leg shackles. He was charged with violating the FACE Act from an incident that had taken place a year earlier when he pushed a volunteer on the sidewalk in front of a Philadelphia abortion facility where Houck and his 12-year-old son had been praying peacefully. The abortion facility's volunteer had begun aggressively harassing Houck's son when Houck, like any good father would, came to his son's defense. The abortion volunteer brought charges against Houck, but those charges were dismissed by both state and local authorities. The federal DOJ, however, did file charges that Houck violated the FACE Act, and despite Houck and his attorneys offering that he would come in voluntarily to respond to the charges, they sent the FBI to raid his home and arrest him. Houck was ultimately acquitted of all charges in a January 2023 jury trial. We also have the more recent case of 9 Christian pro-lifers recently given felony convictions and prison sentences, federal prison sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years by a D.C. court for protesting at a Washington abortuary. And by the way, all of this is taking place against a backdrop of the DOJ and FBI virtually turning a blind eye to the rampant and widespread vandalism against Christian pro-life pregnancy centers, some of which have literally been burned to the ground, with few or no arrests made and no investigations initiated. Another example. You are aware, I'm sure, about the well-documented report that the FBI, until they were recently caught red-handed, had authorized surveillance in traditional Catholic parishes, citing traditional Catholics as potential terrorists. This would be laughable if it weren't so sad. With all the rampant crime in America, this is what our federal government is choosing to investigate and to spend our tax dollars on. And then finally, there's the recent controversy involving Kansas City Chiefs kicker Harrison Butker. Let me summarize this case for you. This was an authentic Catholic husband and father delivering an authentic Catholic commencement address at an authentic Catholic college. And the reaction, predictably, from the mainstream media and many on social media was sneering contempt. By the way, they no doubt believe that this meeting this evening is a gathering of dangerous extremists. Have you thought about that? So turn around for a minute so you can see what your fellow dangerous extremists look like. Doesn't look that dangerous from up here. The truth is, the only thing we are a danger to is their own extremist thinking and their radical ideological indoctrination of our children. All of this represents the very tip of the iceberg in terms of what the totalitarian statists and secularists and their allies in the media and elsewhere have as their end game, their ultimate agenda, which is the complete marginalization and silencing of religion. And so the American people need to arise from lethargy, need to get stirred both to prayer and to action, and we need to be courageous and resolute in defending the truth in the midst of a perverse and hostile culture. I realize that's not easy by any means, and there might be a price to pay for doing so. There usually is. But it is absolutely necessary if our children and grandchildren are to grow up in a free country. So by now you might be saying, okay, I got all that. I understand everything you've just said, but what does it all have to do with parental authority? I would suggest to you that it has a lot to do with it. Because at a minimum, for example, the same FBI that has identified traditional Catholics as potential terrorists has made the same terrorist identification of parents who show up to school board meetings to peacefully monitor what their children are being taught and to make their opinions known. And here's where the religious liberty connection comes in. Whether you are Catholic or Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, or a person of no particular faith tradition, the simple, irrefutable truth is this: you love your children, and you want nothing but the best for them. And whether you realize it or not, that's simply part of the natural law. The natural law is nothing more than the law of God written on the hearts of all men and women intuitively and instinctively. It's like the self-evident natural law that says, do not commit murder. Everyone knows murder is grievously wrong. And the natural law that says, do not harm children by sexualizing them or by exposing them to dangerous and nonsensical ideologies that their tender young minds cannot possibly fathom or discern. And so, ladies and gentlemen, recognize and acknowledge this in your hearts and minds. Children are a gift from God. And as such, they come into our care with certain rights and certain responsibilities for us as parents. We have an absolute God-given right and an absolute God-given responsibility to protect them. And if ever there was a time they needed protection from the dangerous and ill-conceived initiatives of a misguided, overbearing government, it is now. Let me take this thought a step further. We as parents and grandparents have a God-given right and obligation specifically to protect the bodies, minds, and souls of our children and grandchildren in the face of secular governments which, left to their own designs, would destroy their bodies, minds, and souls. Now, is that a rash statement to assert that secular government would destroy the bodies, minds, and souls of our children and grandchildren? I don't think so. Because how then do we explain the widespread impetus to administer puberty-blocking drugs to prepubescent children, or to sexually and permanently mutilate adolescent children, in the name of transgenderism? How do we explain the near-rabid move to expose children as young as 5 to pornographic books in school libraries? Or to have them attend and participate in drag queen shows in public libraries? How do we explain the soul-robbing push to indoctrinate school-aged children with critical race theory, CRT, which teaches them the dangerous absurdity that depending solely on what color skin they have, they are either the oppressor or the oppressed? And by the way, please, I urge you, as Jeff spoke about just a few moments ago, please plan to vote against the proposed amendment to Maryland's Constitution this November, the amendment entitled Right to Reproductive Freedom, because as we have already heard, it is a deceitful misnaming of a bill that will strip parents of their authority over health care decisions for their children. Let me pause here and read something to you from what you might think is an unlikely source. The Catechism of the Catholic Church. Anybody up for a catechism lesson? Deacon, I know you are. I'm going to read a few brief excerpts from the section of the Catechism entitled The Family and Society. Listen carefully to this. Quote, "The role of parents in education is of such importance that it is almost impossible to provide an adequate substitute. The right and the duty of parents to educate their children are primordial and inalienable." Let me read that sentence again. The right and the duty of parents to educate their children are primordial and inalienable. Parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. Public authorities have the duty of guaranteeing this parental right and of ensuring the concrete conditions for its exercise. And that's the end of the quote. And by the way, let's think about one more thing, as one or two of the previous speakers have mentioned. Think back on the COVID pandemic and all the lessons we learned from that experience. I think you would agree that we learned a lot, didn't we? But I would like to focus on just two elements of what we learned, because they are so relevant for what we are addressing this evening. First, we learned how ready, willing, and able public officials are to declare churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship as non-essential. Remember that term? To declare them non-essential and arbitrarily shut us down. Secondly, this goes hand in hand with it. Because of the corresponding lockdown in the nation's schools and the virtual learning that it necessitated, millions of parents across the nation began to discover and wake up to what the schools were teaching their children. And many of them, many of us, were outraged. And so here we are this evening. Let me bring this message to a close with this. I would suggest to you that of all the things in our lives that are worth standing up for and worth fighting for, the three that should be at the very top of all of our lists are the three F's: faith, family, and freedom. Faith, family, and freedom. These three transcend politics and political parties and go to the very heart of who we are as Americans who love our God, our children, and our country. Faith, family, and freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, I urge you, take a stand while there is still time. We must obey God rather than men. Thanks for listening, and God bless you all.